Okay, Judith and Christian, can you hear us? Could you just give us a thumbs up or say yes?
Yeah.
Oh. Now, I'm not sure if it's a personal thing that no one is sitting at the tables in front of us here, or if you're just all shy. It's late on a Friday, you want to be by the door so you can exit first. I understand all of that. Welcome everyone to this close to final wrap up of the day. My name is Barbara Grantham, and I'm the president and CEO of Care Canada, which is one of the world's largest international NGOs, humanitarian and development organizations. It's been around since 1945 in the aftermath of World War II. Your fun fact, so that you can impress all your friends over the weekend, is you can say, do you know the origin of the care package? Because it's a term, kind of a vernacular that we use all the time when you have a sick friend. You say, I'm going to visit so-and-so and I'm going to take them a care package. But in the aftermath of World War II, the American military had an abundant supply of remaining non-perishable supplies: toothpaste, deodorant, chocolate, stockings, socks. And they wanted to distribute them to the very, very poverty-stricken population of Europe, mostly women and children. But they didn't have the wherewithal to do it themselves. So they turned to a coalition of 22 American charities and asked them if they would distribute all of those goods. And those 22 American charities put those non-perishable goods into care packages, which stood for Cooperative American Relief in Europe. I know, that was me too. And over the course of the last 80-ish years, CARE has evolved into a global humanitarian and development organization. We work in over 100 countries in any given year, with gender equality and investment in women's leadership at the core of what we do. We are no longer called Cooperative American Relief in Europe. We're called Cooperative Assistance and Relief Everywhere. So there you go. You can impress your friends or your family. It is my very distinct pleasure to be here with you all this afternoon as one of the few, I think, non-academics in the room. And I say that, I have to admit, with more than a little bit of trepidation. But I hope maybe to serve as a little bit of a bridge, because I'm keenly aware, if not from the last session more than anything else, several times the phrase, how do we bring civil society organizations into this conversation? And I am with one of those civil society organizations that we talk about when we say, how do we take this out? How do we get this to civil society, human rights defending organizations? So our task this afternoon is to, as darkness falls, quite literally, it will be dark when we finish, not in the ephemeral sense, but in the literal sense outside. It will be dark when we finish. And Rujin will wrap up at the end of the day. But our task is to look ahead. If we're wrapping the last 75 years since the establishment of the World Health Organization, how do we look ahead to the next 75 years? And in particular to those of you in this room who are the next generation of thought leadership, not only for this country, but for around the world, whether it's as academics, as civil society leaders, as thought leaders in some kind of a capacity. And to me, the title of this workshop is apt and timely. It's called Advancing Health Justice in a Turbulent World. And for me, there are three key words in that title: advancing, justice, and turbulent. The turbulent part is not going to change in the foreseeable future. So how do we advance health justice, knowing that the road ahead is unstable, uncertain, and turbulent? We have 4 fantastic speakers to bring the day home, to put that very question to all of you. Lisa Foreman is with the Dalla Lana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. I'm not going to go and read, with all due respect, everyone's bios, because you're all in graduate school and you can read. And so I'm just going to give a quick highlight. Lisa's come from Toronto to be with us here in person, obviously, in Ottawa today. Chidi Ogomanan is with the University of Ottawa, Faculty of Law. And so Chidi didn't have to come as far as Lisa to be with us today. And online, we have two additional wonderful guests. Kristen Curtis is with the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, the UN. And I believe, Kristen, you're in New York today. Yeah. And Judith Bonita. I'm so sorry, Judith. Judith Bonita de Maquita is at the University of Essex in the Center for Health Rights. So we've got a reasonable representation of both Canadian and international thought leaders with us today to tackle this issue of advancing health justice in a turbulent world. The format that we'll take, because I am aware that at the end of the day, there may be things you all want to talk about with this wonderful panel. So each of the four will open with some thoughts about that very question for 5 to 7 minutes. And then we'll have a little bit of a conversation, the 5 of us, I hope, assuming the technology is going to work. And then I'm very quickly going to turn it over to all of you to have conversation with these 4 wonderful thought leaders. And at 5 o'clock, I'll turn it over to Regine, who will wrap up the day, because by then I will be keenly aware that we are the only thing that stands between you and that thing called the weekend, whether it's Netflix and popcorn or a pub in the market or whatever it might be. So, Lisa, would you please start?
Thank you, Barbara, for that fabulous opening of this panel. And I want to just thank Regine for inviting me to participate in this incredibly exciting day. I'm a very big fan of Professor Habibi's work, and I'm absolutely delighted that she's beginning her independent faculty career at this fantastic law school, and equally delighted that the law school has landed such a rising star in this field. I especially appreciate the invitation to think about the future of health rights on this incredibly important milestone in the international human rights law system. I think it's hard sometimes for us to grasp how young the international human rights law system is. Whatever our ages in this room, most of us were born into a world where the language and the ideas of human rights are deeply enmeshed into how we think about equity, justice, fairness. Even if we're deeply critical of the language, the institutions, and the outcomes of human rights, and even where we know that they need to evolve to keep pace with the seismic changes we've seen in this world since 1948. But I think that to be at the 75-year mark is in some ways an invitation to bring a temporal perspective to this area. Not just to consider what the passing of time means for realizing and evolving rights. I mean, in economic, social, and cultural rights, time is literally the unit of assessment, progressive realization, immediate realization. It's built into the way that we conceptualize rights. But to zoom out from the granular and the everyday way in which we approach rights to a much larger sweeping view of the system of norms, actors, and laws, to look backwards and forwards in time. So what I'm going to do in my remarks is consider where health rights have come from since 1948, consider briefly where they are now, and then think about where we might hope that they would be 75 years from now in 2098. So 75 years ago today, which was 2 days before the UN General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Health, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the idea of health as a human right was very, very new. Only 2 years before, the WHO Constitution had indicated that health was a fundamental human right, laying the foundations for the Universal Declaration's recognition of a right to a standard of living adequate for health and well-being that included things like medical care. And that in turn laid the foundation for the international covenant's recognition of a right to the highest attainable standard of health, which imposed states, duties on states to realize. Now, it's hard to overstate what a dramatic transformation this was. if in 1912 you had opened an international law textbook, it would have said that even if the scholarly idea of the so-called rights of mankind included things like life, health, and liberty, that such rights do not enjoy any guarantee whatever from the law of nations, and they cannot enjoy such guarantee, since the law of nations is a law between states, and since individuals cannot be subjects of the law. That's a direct quote from 1912 International Law textbook. And I very much doubt that Oppenheim, who wrote those words, could have foreseen the dramatic transformation that came 40 years later, when international law turned quite definitively to the state's relationship with its population and made individuals subjects of international law, and saw the legalization of health rights lay the foundations of much of what has emerged since. Now, from the start, these rights have been deeply shaped by their context, from the post-war recognition of the need to protect against the horrors of the Second World War, to the enormous influence of Cold War politics on the drafting and recognition of economic, social, and cultural rights. And I think if not for the Cold War, we can question whether economic, social, and cultural rights like health would have been made subject to progressive realization within resources. But certainly we can also know that if it hadn't been the Cold War that did that, it would have probably been neoliberalism that would have somehow short-circuited the realization of those rights. And certainly at the time that the covenant was being drafted, the USSR argued that progressive realization was an attempt by the US to give states a loophole to evade what they argued were pitifully inadequate economic, social, and cultural rights. And that's a critique that persists to this day. And I think that context is a very good part of why health rights lay largely fallow until HIV and AIDS provoked civil society globally to seek the protection of rights against what was very pervasive health rights injustices. So much of how rights are shaped, health rights are shaped and wielded today comes from that pandemic, from the way that it understood our understandings of the right to health and the need for that right to extend beyond health systems into things like intellectual property, to seeding Jonathan Mann's powerful ideas about the interconnections between health and human rights that fermented the modern health and human rights movement many of us are part of. I think in the decades since then, it's arguable that health rights have experienced a maturation of sorts in their legal, social, and political development and uptake, from really major increases in the ratification of treaties that contain them, significant increases in the amount of countries that constitutionally protect health rights in their constitutions and bills of rights and other legislation, to the increasingly specific interpretation and enforcement of this right at multiple levels, from the creation of international mechanisms to enforce the right to health and a UN special rapporteur on this right, to a growing body of international, regional, and domestic case law, to the growth of a health and human rights civil society around the world who push for human rights compliant laws and policies, from issues like sexual and reproductive health rights to disability, to LGBT health, migrant and refugee health, climate, environment, indigenous, and BIPOC health. But whatever the gains we have made in this area, I think health rights have similarly struggled to deal with some of the most pressing challenges we face in global health, from deepening economic inequalities, persistent health disparities, the climate crisis, and an inadequately governed global pandemic that saw gross disparities in the distribution of COVID vaccines. And all of this is taking place at a time of tremendous social, economic, and political upheaval and crisis that directly impact and oftentimes target human rights and international law. For 19 years now, Freedom House has reported a growing and deepening governance trend away from democracy and human rights towards autocracy and reduced civil freedoms. At the same time that we've seen human rights and international law become flashpoints in cultural wars and to be seen now as incompatible with right-wing politics and governance. And all of this amplified during COVID, when science, fact, evidence, public health, international law, and human rights were attacked in an age of rampant, calculated, and weaponized misinformation and disinformation. We're at the end of history that Francis Fukuyama posited we had reached in the late 80s, when he said that humanity had, through liberal democracy and economic liberalization, achieved its final perfected form. In as much as economic neoliberalism has massively amplified in the decades since Fukuyama wrote that, it has decoupled from liberal democracies in ways that spell a future of economic supremacy allied to political illiberalism. Something I started to think of as neo-illiberalism after Trump was elected, and which has been metastasizing before our eyes into something even uglier and more threatening. So it seems fair to say post-COVID and post and possibly pre-Trump that we're at a crossroads facing a range of possible futures for health rights, some of which are frankly terrifying to consider. And because for me, I personally have found ideas of human rights unlinked from a hopeful vision of peace, justice, and human well-being and flourishing to be frankly, personally and professionally untenable. I think if we are to imagine what human rights might look like in 2098, perhaps the better question is what we might hope a scholar at the 150th anniversary of the UDHR would say about the state of health rights. I'd hope that they'd speak about a deepening and widening of the norms, laws, and institutions and impact of health-related human rights, that we had succeeded in expanding our notions of the human side of human rights, and that we explicitly recognize human rights protections for older people, for the LGBT, for the stateless and undocumented, that we had expanded notions of human rights beyond simply the human, and that we valued and protected life in multiple forms, from animals to our natural environment and planet, to new forms of machine or artificial life. That health as a right was no longer debated, but deeply entrenched in a vibrant human rights whole that had expanded beyond borders and beyond states. And that we had solved some of the long-standing problems we still grapple with in the balance between commerce and health and its impact on access to fundamental healthcare and goods and on widening material gaps, and in the devastating and compounding impacts of racism and gender inequality on health. I'd hope that we could say most fundamentally that power and resources had become more equally and fairly distributed within and between societies, so that when a pandemic hits 100 years from now, ideals like solidarity, equity, and human rights mean something and are realized and respected in governance and in the allocation of essential medical knowledge and goods, that all countries have the capacity and autonomy to meet their fundamental health needs, and that all people everywhere flourish in health, well-being, and peace. I know what I'm saying sounds like a fairy tale, but I'd prefer to think of it as more of a human rights prayer, and no less impossible than if one of us had gone to Oppenheim in 1912 and given him a straightforward depiction of what the international human rights law system looks like now. No less a fairy tale than that would have been to him then. I'll end there.
Thank you, Lisa, for that really eloquent call to action for all of us. Christian, live from New York. I'm sorry. Do you want to share your thoughts with us, please?
Sure. Thank you. Thanks for the invitation, particularly to Regine. So I think that the question calls a little bit to process the lessons from the pandemic through the legacy and the spirit of the Universal Declaration, and check whether the commitments and promises of the Universal Declaration, both still unfulfilled, are still valid. And so I make 4 brief points. The first one is the renewed call for universality. The pandemic has shown that it makes no sense to tackle the health needs of some parts of the population without taking consideration of particularly the most vulnerable ones. So it wouldn't have made sense to vaccine only those who could pay the vaccines, or only legal migrants and leave behind the ones that couldn't pay, or undocumented migrants. So a sense of universality resonate with the idea of a universal right to health, a right that belongs to everyone, and to the calls that are enshrined in the Universal Declaration, in the Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultures, and in other documents, General Command 14 by the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, ILO Recommendation 202 on social protection floors, and the 2030 Agenda, Sustainable Development Goals, particular targets 3.8 and 3.7, calling for universal health coverage. I think, I mean, the two ends match there. There's no way to tackle a next pandemic or next public emergency without taking seriously this. This doesn't mean that there's a one-size-fits-all design of health systems. States can consider the inclusion of public providers, private providers. They can consider the ability to pay as a variable, etc. But in the final round, the issue is everyone should be covered by the health system in an equitable way. So I think this is a clear lesson from the pandemic. I would say a second one is the interdependence with other rights. If you look at the way in which Article 25 of the Universal Declaration is framed, health is one factor among others that are the ones that ensure an adequate standard of living. And the pandemic showed that those that were more hit by the pandemic were the ones that actually lacked access to other services, including adequate housing, water and sanitation, food, social protection, and decent conditions of work. So as underlying factors, underlying conditions of health, the provision of these rights is also a main lesson regarding the ways to prevent unequal impacts of future emergencies. So that means the right to health is not only a right to access health services, but should include the coverage of other factors that underlie health. So a third interesting conclusion is the idea of accountability, including access to effective remedies. Emergencies such as the pandemic show that measures go through trial and errors with the risk of making mistakes, and these mistakes can include discrimination, decision making based on stereotypes, over or under inclusion, wrong prioritization, disproportionate limitation of other rights. In many countries in the world, access to remedies, access to justice, and the possibility of an independent evaluation, an impartial independent evaluation of measures taken by the government has at least mitigated these errors, these mistakes, and reestablished justice. So there are many examples from different jurisdictions in the world where the measures taken by the government with the justification of public health have been screened, and some of them have been deemed either unconstitutional, contrary to international human rights law, or to other legal standards. So in occasions such as emergencies, one usual argument is, well, remedies can come too late, and this is true in many cases. In the realm of emergencies, the time needed for judicial decisions might be too long. But even in those cases, there have been interesting examples of guarantees of non-repetition. Just taking a Colombian example, the Constitutional Court of Colombia, after the pandemic, decided a case on which the main argument was the exclusion of persons with disabilities and older persons from the prioritization of in access to emergency care and access to emergency ventilators and other urgent care. So even if the decision was taken after the pandemic was over, the remedies that were ordered by the court direct the government to create protocols for the next occasion. So so remedies can be effective even with a forward-looking approach. A third one, and the fourth one I want to underscore is international dimensions, including international cooperation and assistance. Public health is not only a national common good, but it's a global common good. But scientific development on health is highly concentrated in developed countries. So there's a need, the pandemic has shown that there is a need to strengthen international systems to ensure access by all countries to adequate treatment, medicines, vaccines, and other health goods and facilities. Interestingly, the Universal Declaration also provides for these ideas. There's a one by including the right to benefit or enjoy the shared scientific advancement and its benefit as a universal right. But second, by an interesting clause in the Universal Declaration, which is the one that opens the idea of universality beyond borders, which is Article 28, the idea that everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which the rights and freedoms set forth by the Declaration can be fully realized. And that means inequalities among countries need to be tackled, and the inequalities regarding the development, commercialization, development of scientific research and the outputs of that need to be made accessible to countries that cannot master this process. So I think if one asks whether the Universal Declaration is still relevant to tackle today and tomorrow problems, I would say yes, it's still relevant, and many of the, say, unfulfilled promises of the Universal Declaration are still illuminating in terms of the road, the goals we need to over. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Christian. Judith Bueno de Mesquita, I think are you in Essex today?
I'm in Essex in the United Kingdom, yeah.
Yes, okay, so it's well into Friday evening. You are very gracious to join us and make your day a very long one. Judith, please share your thoughts.
Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this wonderful event, and many congratulations to Rujin and all others who've been involved in pulling it together. I'm not going to speak to a slideshow, but I want to just start with one slide if I can. Hang on. Yeah, it's going to work. Okay. So I wanted just to start with a slide from Essex to Ottawa. It's International Human Rights Day on Sunday at Essex University. We have a Human Rights Week in which we have many events celebrating human rights. And one of the central features of our week is what we call the chalking of the steps. So these are steps which are right in the centre of the university. As you can see, our university is quite modern, well, maybe not modern enough, but quite concrete, 1960s. And we have these steps, and every year in Human Rights Week, the Student Human Rights Society coordinates the chalking of the steps, and some of our human rights students come together very early on a Friday morning, 8 o'clock on a Friday morning, and they choose to chalk the different articles of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights in various languages, reflecting our international community. And this remains in the university throughout the year. It's in a covered area, and it's a constant reminder of the importance of human rights. And as Christian mentioned just now, also of the interdivisibility of all human rights. And those of us who work in the field of health and human rights, we focus often on the right to health, but of course there are many other human rights which we must remember to promote and protect if we are to enjoy the highest attainable standard of health. So I want to focus a little bit beyond the sort of theme of today's event in terms of the pandemic and the principles and guidelines, human rights principles and guidelines. I'm going to focus on other, draw my presentation out to look at other issues for health and human rights, and also to take a bit of a broader view of where we are with human rights 75 years after the Universal Declaration on Human Rights was adopted. And looking forward to maybe not quite the next 75 years, but for the next decade at any rate. And I'm going to look back before looking forwards. And I'm going to look back to the start of my own human rights journey, which really started, consciously started in the year 2000 when I enrolled as an LLM student in international human rights law at Essex University. And I was just been reflecting back on it, and actually it was a time of great optimism for human rights. The Cold War had fairly recently ended, and there was probably unprecedented international consensus around human rights. And that's not to say on all issues. There were issues which were contentious, there were issues which were struggling, but there was a broad consensus that human rights were important and should be promoted and protected. It was also a particular time of hope for health and human rights. And just before I started my journey as a student, just 2 months before I started my journey as a student, General Comment 14 on the right to health by the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights was adopted. And we read it in one of our first classes. And its clear guidance seemed to promise a really helpful way forward for realising the right to health, which had historically been neglected by the international human rights community. So were we just naive as students? Well, certainly we were very hopeful. And at that time, we had received, I would say, a rather positivist human rights education. But in the subsequent years, I feel that actually this optimism and sense of progress seemed to be borne out by notable progress in areas including the increasingly widespread recognition and acceptance that health is a fundamental human right, as well as groundbreaking decisions on the right to health in relation to issues like access to medicines, maternal health, safe abortion, as well as increasing take-up of the right to health and human rights across UN institutions like the World Health Organization, both through instruments like the International Health Regulations, as well as at a more day-to-day level in policies and programs. Equally, some of you will know this, some of you may not, but NGOs like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch had been incredibly resistant to economic, social and cultural rights until that time, and getting them to focus on economic, social and cultural rights and the right to health was a fairly intense struggle. And from this time, health and human rights scholarship also bloomed. So I think it's really important to recognise these very positive developments, and in many ways how we're better set up to promote and protect human rights in the field of health than we were several years ago. But this feeling of optimism was sort of accompanied by a rather linear sense of progress, of things improving, and it was well captured by remarks made by the then UN Secretary General Kofi Annan back in 2005, that he observed that human rights was moving from an age of declaration to an age of implementation. Fast forward 20 years, and this mood of optimism has been tempered by a rather different direction of travel in some areas that really raises questions about whether we have in fact moved past declaration. The governments and international organisations certainly declaring one thing, but then doing another. This is a case across the human rights field, but it is very evident looking at the field of global health. Take the COVID-19 response, for example. Many, but not all governments and international organisations were very quick to declare that human rights would be central to pandemic responses, but this was not borne out in our experience. Vaccine inequality, racial disparities in COVID-19 mortality rates, the mental health crisis among young people, the burden of migrants and refugees, which Christian had referred to, and the awful failure to protect older people and people with disabilities and responses are just some of those failings. The promise to build back better in the wake of COVID-19 has also been cast into doubt in an increasingly unequal world. Likewise, we are witnessing the disregard of the right to health in other critical areas, and we need to look no further than ongoing international conflicts, whether those in Israel and Gaza, Ukraine or Sudan, where we find that health systems have been caught up in hostilities and with scant regard for other rules of international humanitarian law and human rights law, including protections against gender-based violence. But we are also witnessing increasing threats to human rights and health and human rights from other challenges, among them climate change. and in the context of the growth of artificial intelligence, as well as deepening financial and economic inequalities under global economic governance, and the rise of the private sector in health and in other sectors, both in terms of its influence on government and in many contexts, accompanied by a lack of accountability. Another threat is that to democratic governance and civil liberties. And I also want to just flag that human rights defenders or environmental rights defenders are increasingly at risk, whether that's through violence or acts of violence, and also in the context of shrinking civil society space and tightening legislation against protest in many countries. At the same time, there are increasing challenges to human rights norms and law. At the political and government level, for example, in the UK, until recently Home Secretary recently declared her belief that our Human Rights Act, which incorporates the European Convention on Human Rights, should be called the Criminal Rights Act. Likewise, we've seen threats and rollbacks to women's rights, including to abortion in the US, and rising threats in other countries to those rights. But beyond the sort of political critique, I think another interesting thing to witness is the rise of critical scholarship, whether that's Marxist scholarship or feminist scholarship or Twelve scholarship, questioning whether human rights is fit for purpose. Has it reached its potential and really caused transformative change for disadvantaged populations? There are those who say that human rights are too Western, too individualistic, too legalistic, too technocratic, too top-down, too overstretched, and perhaps they've had their day. Yet, amidst all this neglect and doubt, I want to end with a few forward-looking comments about the value of human rights and health and where it needs to go. So no, I do not believe that human rights have had their day. Firstly, human rights are here to stay. They've got broad legal recognition internationally, regionally, and domestically in all countries. At this institutional level, they are very well entrenched, though there are areas where states and others may be critical of rights. In other areas, there is undeniable commitment in areas like equality and non-discrimination, education, life, and even health, I would say. Secondly, the challenges are very political. The doors are not as open as they once were, but if we are serious in terms of being human rights activists and scholars, and in our commitment to defend the marginalised and disadvantaged, we should not be downhearted. It's an important time to continue this struggle, even if it's frustrating at times. Thirdly, unfortunately, the old challenges for health and human rights have not really gone away and are under attack again in some quarters. And we must continue to work on them, whether that is preparing for the next pandemic so that human rights guide equitable and effective responses rather than being the first thing to be sacrificed, whether it's defending abortion rights and women's broader sex and reproductive health and rights. But we have enormous rising global health challenges, among them artificial intelligence, the climate and ecological crises. There is a need to centre human rights, including health and human rights research in these areas to protect humanity against threats which are potentially existential. And rather just addressing the symptoms of these threats, we need to think about some of their causes, the political systems, the economic systems, and the inequalities between people with power and responsibility and those who will bear the consequences of these threats. In addressing these challenges, the health and human rights community must work with other communities. We have a strong tradition of interdisciplinary work in health and human rights, and that was referred to earlier by John Packer. So human rights scholars, legal scholars have worked for many years, for example, with epidemiologists, but we also need to broaden our interactions with people working on technology, climate scientists, anthropologists, and economists, but most importantly, keep working with rights holders to build effective and sustainable rights-based solutions and constantly respond to the knowledge that they bring. And we can learn from them. We can learn from different discourses, different ideas, and keep on thinking in the light of this in how human rights can best respond to these challenges. Finally, it seems to me that the appetite for human rights has not dwindled among the most important population and stakeholder, which is the marginalised and dispossessed populations around the world whose human rights are at threat. And we continue to see how human rights are deployed to inspire social movements, whether in sort of traditional human rights areas or in new areas like climate for human rights, including among, for example, climate activists. And there I will finish my remarks and hand back over to Chidi.
You, please.
Thank you. It's just a great opportunity. I don't know why Roisin scheduled me for the last. Maybe because when you have to speak last, you already have the answers everybody has given. And then you decide to say, okay, I'll copy from all your answers. Or you just calibrate your response. And that's what I would do. And in so doing, you will hear me making references to what we have had already. So number one, the way to approach this for me, and I will really pay attention to Barbara's words, advancing health justice. And I also picked up something that was said earlier by, it was Professor Yasmin, that experts often leave out consideration for marginalized populations. And therefore, in reflecting on this, I think I want to focus narrowly on a marginalized population, which is to speak about indigenous peoples' right to health, and to speak about it in the context of back and forward of how the human rights architecture has evolved in this space. And that will also give me a sense of case study. And as I go on, I begin to talk about what we expect to happen in the future of international human rights in the context of health. But when I want to say indigenous peoples, I want to also make sure, like John was saying earlier, I'm not bound by the saltwater indigeneity or settler, non-settler indigeneity. It might apply, it might not apply, but I want to think broadly. And therefore, I give tribute to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights on Human Rights, Article 25.1, and the Covenant on Social and Cultural Rights, Article 12. And we know that the Universal Declaration, has always been the very inspiration of all other human rights framework. I just wondered how immortal that very document seemed to be and relevant. And so one thing I want to also say is this. I was advised also by Professor Mendez to really use a kind of a shocking conscience approach. So think about what happened in September 28th, 2020, about an Aboriginal woman called Joyce Echequan in Canada here. For those who do not know, this 37-year-old woman had to die in the hands of her caregivers and being accused of making wrong choices and taunted typical racial stereotyping, and she died. So 10 years from now, can we have another Joyce Echequan experience anywhere in the world, particularly in the developed world such as Canada? And so why do I use this indigenous people's right to health as my case study for this intervention? And this document, that is the international human rights instruments, always talk about all peoples, everyone, all persons. Read the Universal Declaration, read the civil, cultural, all the rights, they're talking all. But we know that what we have delivered so far is that all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. And a vision of the future of international health, human rights and health would be to say that the injustice of equality and perennial debate of formal and substantive equality will continue to stalk human rights. And how do we go about solving this problem? Maybe we should be thinking about the fact that even within the human rights architecture itself, there are special measures of protection for various categories based on vulnerability. And that has not been at the very foundation. If you look at these instruments, they made references to those, but in terms of where the rubber hits the road, we fall short. And so why have we, despite all the efforts and struggles so far, left indigenous peoples under the same despicable historical profile of underperforming in regard to all the social determinants of health. And so it was Professor Mera who said health disparities as rights violation. And this is consistently going on over and over. What is the future of human rights and health when a particular people are underperforming consistently without any significant improvement? So if you do the same thing over and over again and you get the same answer, somebody defined it as stark madness. And so how can we change this narrative? And now we see why I'm singling out indigenous peoples is that they are exposed to all prohibited grounds of discrimination known to human rights jurisprudence. So you can enumerate race, color, sex, language, all of them, name them. But international regime on indigenous people's right to health did not begin to evolve because that means we want to extricate indigenous people as a special vulnerable category. But all the package was all people, every person, everyone. That's what we were told until 21 years after the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And I was so happy that Professor Parker made mention of the ILO Convention 1969. That is the first major attempt to begin to address health-related vulnerabilities of indigenous peoples in labor and employment, in issues of occupational safety and hazards, in terms of migrant workers, agriculture, bonded labor, sexual harassment, that this special population were dealt with in this context. It took 21 years after. So the point then is this, that this is a regime that evolves and continues to seek to fix every loophole that may be found. And then you fast forward 60 years later, we had the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And some of the legal scholars here about human rights jurisprudence will speak to this as a declaration. There are declarations and there are declarations. Most of us know how influential this declaration has become in norm-making. So Article 24 repeats the cultural rights Article 12, but it sums up the scope of rights to health in the context of indigenous peoples in two parts and says, these rights are rights to traditional medicines and traditional health practices, including conservation of vital medicinal plants, animals, and minerals. And the other right regime is the rights of indigenous peoples to all social and mainstream health services. Now, something has been introduced into this space, traditional medicine, and it speaks to inclusivity in science and research, about how we could use an inclusive epistemic approach to health innovation. And that is an extension of the human rights of the people. So the idea of health is one that incorporates all worldviews of health. And so as a system that continues to evolve, in 2007, we now had an entrenchment of issues of indigenous people's health within the United Nations system. Think about the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples, which was established by the Human Rights Council, mandated to conduct targeted studies on the rights of indigenous peoples. And they have been able to do a big research in 2016 on the indigenous people's rights with a focus on children and youth. So before that, of course, some of us know about the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, beginning to supply critical information, research-based, in order to address this gap. So the activities of these specialized organizations that focus on indigenous bodies now begin to draw attention to disease-specific socioeconomic induced health situations that are peculiar to indigenous peoples. And this is very important. And extending this narrative about indigenous peoples as marginalized peoples in the context of health, we see some other, the United Nations, the Universal Declaration inspired subsidiary international human rights instruments, and particularly the interpretative jurisprudence, even as we had before from Judith in relation to the general comment. So some of the human rights instruments that stand alone are now being extended into the peculiarities of indigenous people. So think about a Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, Convention on Elimination of Racial Discrimination, even Convention on Narcotic Drugs. And so we begin to see how this system has decided to plug the gaps that was already established. So point then being this, there is something good to be said about how a system evolves to take those that have fallen from the crack. But today we have had significant intervention that we have moved beyond declaration to a stage of implementation. And this is where we have a dismal report. And that is where Joyce Eshekwan's case still comes to haunt and to taunt everybody. So to conclude, I have some three major points to raise in terms of not only how some of these issues I've raised is to call attention to designing a global health framework based on human rights that addresses the interest of the most vulnerable consistently, not allowing them to fall from the crack. But now it is a time for national accountability. It's a time where domestic policies will begin to really match all the talks with action as opposed to hypocritical disposition that so many of us have mentioned here. So reporting mechanisms have to be extended. Court cases have to continue to be litigated up to the Supreme Court level. Advocacy has never been more in need than it is today, as most of us have spoken today. So the most important thing in terms of what I put on the table that will help this national accountability, we have to begin to rethink data and research ethics in this space. And we now see already that indigenous peoples have been talking about data sovereignty. Beyond data sovereignty, data aggregation is a critical element, not only for research involving indigenous peoples, but also for monitoring progress and implementation of policy, providing authentic comparative information to hold states accountable through human rights reporting processes. So data has been talked about for so long, but now we begin to use data to hold states accountable. How about new technologies? So related to data, that is my second point. New technologies that deploy data through diverse platforms and mechanisms, including generative artificial intelligence and their complex applications. The intersections and the melding of boundaries of life sciences. Now we cannot draw any solid boundary between agriculture, food, and medicine, and lately the environment. This will further complicate our understanding of social determinants of health and problematize representation and legitimacy and epistemic inclusion. So this is really the major work that is cut out for us going forward in this space. So, but one thing under this number 2, I'm inclined solidly to put on the table for our conversation. It is about time that technology is recognized as one of the traditionally prohibited grounds of discrimination in human rights jurisprudence, particularly where technology would put those that are really weak in a disadvantage as we begin to think about the consequences of representation in artificial intelligence, especially as it applies to health. And finally, my point is the politics of knowledge governance. You see, when you look at the WHO and all it has done about traditional medicine, and also look at the text of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So much emphasis is put on traditional medicine. And as I indicated earlier, they're talking about animals, plants, and materials. This is talking about chemicals for making of medicines. Nobody talks about traditional medical knowledge. So that leap and distinction is really very significant, because if you don't include the practices associated with traditional medicine, you are completely throwing away a very fundamental epistemic contribution of other worldviews into innovations in the context of health. So the consequence here now is that we have exposed indigenous people's rights to health by putting too much emphasis on the medicinal aspect of traditional knowledge. We have exposed indigenous people's right to health to the politics of intellectual property, genetic resources, access, and benefit sharing. Now, indigenous peoples are now forced to navigate the science of dematerialization of physical genetic resources. And this has consequences for the cultural context for the production of knowledge. So this happens, as we see already at the pandemic treaty, through digital sequence information or some other names so-called. So we have a task, because this is a monumental epistemic shift that has potential to further weaken indigenous peoples in this very space. So my point then is this, just to sum up, is to say that we have built a system that does not prioritize the most vulnerable, that remembers them as footnotes and then calls them up and begins to build another regime to mediate it. What I want to suggest is that in the next 10, 20, 75 years, how would international health order matches human rights expectations? The most important priority of human rights is to take care of the most vulnerable in the society. And that is the kind of health regime we are about to be building. That is to say, a fire approach, a firefighting approach, not boundary building, so that if there is a crisis in Namibia, we should be able, through a One Health strategy, put out the fire there before acquiring vaccines in Canada that will never be used. So why don't we have a global health framework that is really global, that thinks about all animals as being equal, not some being more equal than others? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Christian, Judith, Chidi, Lisa. You've given all of us a lot to think about as we move towards departing. We have about 10 minutes, maybe a little bit more, for questions and commentary from all of you. You've had 4 remarkable presentations of thought leadership, I think, in the last 40-ish minutes. Some very clear, consistent themes from these 4 intellectual leaders. First hand is in the back, please.
Thank you very much. First of all, I almost don't want to say anything because I think Chidi just ended in a perfect way. But since we've got 10 or 15 minutes, I'm going to add, if you allow me to abuse the floor, a little story that might be interesting to know that links a bit with the last panel and is inspired by what Judith began her presentation with. She showed the chalking of the steps, which is now an act of law at the University of Essex, but I'm not sure if Judith knows the origin. But I want to tell you something about it because it's maybe a story about how you make change, and it's how you move from something that might not be so evident into making established practice. So I was the director at the University of Essex Human Rights Center at the time, and it was about 2007, 2008. And we were coming up to 10th of December, and the graduate students, mainly LLMs and Masters of Arts students, wanted to know something. It was not as uplifting, maybe, Judith, as you recall. A lot of people were still at that period not sure. I think it's part of the mentality of people working in the field. You're daunted, overwhelmed by the challenges, size of the challenges. So the question was, what could we do that would be meaningful to us, but also convey something to others? And we had done a few things, reading provisions of the Universal Declaration in the squares. The University of Essex has squares, open public squares, and things like that. Undergraduates did like a manifestation and things like that. And we thought, well, maybe something else. And those steps you saw, it's a pure chance that I don't recall now if they're 15 steps up or is it 30 steps, but in any event, it works out to be 30 steps. And the Universal Declaration of Rights has 30 provisions, 30 articles, I should say, not provisions. So then we thought, well, maybe people have to walk up these steps every day when they come in, and there are thousands of people come in, and you can't avoid looking at the steps, otherwise you fall over. And it's a kind of gray granite, so it's a nice canvas to do something on. And we thought, why don't we, surreptitiously or in some kind of discreet way, come out early and just paint them? And so we were kind of thinking to do something disruptive and crazy. And so problematical, though, to do that. How do we do it? And we thought, should we paint them and so forth? Well, the other thing is I was a professor and a director. I can't just do stuff like that. The university's going to get upset and they're going to say, who the hell did that and who authorized it and so forth. So I went to the administration. I said, we have this idea. We'd like to put these texts on. And of course, their answer was no. So I don't know if you know this, Judith. The initial response was no, right? Because like, who's going to clean this? And that's going to cost and so forth and so on. So then we can say, oh, we'll put chalk because you can wash it off. So we decided, we went out to a Tesco nearby, we bought colored chalk, we came back. Next question was, the Universal Declaration is too long to chalk. So I stayed up 2, 3 in the morning. Francoise Hampson was in an office across the hall and so forth. Judith, you won't be surprised. And rewrote the whole Universal Declaration of Human Rights in short, no more than kind of 6 words an article or 7 words an article. Not the easiest thing to do, by the way. And then we circulated that, and a group of students, everyone said we're going to come. And guess what? Not everyone came, because this is something else we need to know. People are like rah-rah until they have to show up at 7:30 in the morning on a cold morning. And then a whole lot fewer people showed up. But nonetheless, people came and we did it, and we were afraid what would happen. Turned out people loved it. We started to get emails. This is fabulous. Why don't you paint it? And we could keep it and so forth, which of course we didn't. But the reason I tell you this is because what happened is we did it 1 year, once as an event. We did it a second year, twice as a practice. And the third year, it's a tradition. And now it's a tradition. People don't even know where it began and how it began, but the university is now delighted by it. It's now an established practice. They're now proud of it. They put it in all their documents. They claim it everywhere. Everyone reads it all the time. So I mention this because the last panel was talking, how do we move in the kind of instruments? And that's not an easy thing. And I can tell you from the OSCE and other places I've worked, which are not treaty-based, you can achieve a lot of practice, but you have to find, and kind of this coincidence of chance, of initiative, of repeated action, so that it becomes normalized action and it becomes tradition and it becomes established practice. And I think there's something to take away from that, because I don't believe that a treaty-based approach is going to turn the key. We are living in a shameless period. Treaties are violated left and right now. Even Westphalian paradigm treaties, such as inviolability of frontiers, are violated. And so I really think we have to talk about practice. Sorry to take so much time. Thank you.
Okay. Who else? I know you're there.
I think this is a question mostly for Lisa, and it's about the hopefulness that comes from students and sort of building the next generation. And I wanted to get a sense of how we take human rights from outside the legal paradigm, where those of us who are working in a formalist tradition are thinking about treaties and treaty interpretation, and create this culture of rights, particularly in the health space. So how do we make sure that everyone who is out there practicing health policy, practicing medicine, practicing nursing, practicing physician assistants, how do we make human rights part of the culture of practice so that these things have a taken for granted quality, so that we can reach that level of hope where we don't have to fight these fights in the courtrooms, but that we've won them in the public sphere?
And that's a fantastic question, Ben. I mean, I think part of maybe the primary thing to take is that human rights are not the domain of lawyers. You know, human rights are not the property or even the appropriate exercise of the legal profession. We're lawyers because a lot of it resides in law, but human rights are the expression of something fundamental, something fundamentally human. Like, it's not disciplinary, it's human. And I think this is the part that I think we sometimes fail in within human rights, is that we get bound in the legal and the technical. I mean, I spend my life in, you know, I have thought more about progressive realization than any person ever should. Because, you know, the formulation really matters. It matters in a courtroom. But there's something much more fundamental. I don't mean to sound kind of like religious about it, because human rights are not a religion either. But there is something, there's an ideational, conceptual prayer, hope within the concept, something that I never, no matter how much despair I think we all face on a daily basis, I never ever stop wondering at the power of that fundamental idea that every person, irrespective, has inalienable rights without distinction. I think there's something incredibly, incredibly powerful in it. So to answer your question, Ben, I mean, I think integrating human rights beyond the legal, I mean, I think the fact that some medical schools graduate doctors and give them a copy of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights instead of the Hippocratic Oath is an excellent start. And that's the kind of way we need to be thinking about this. How do we integrate what we have, and how do we build towards what we want to have? Because, I think there are appropriate critiques of what we have, at the same time as those critiques should not obliterate the incredible beauty and power of what we have.
Thank you.
I think this is a question for Lisa. I was really inspired by the foresight piece, or what you would want to see in 2098. And I share your optimism. My optimism is also sometimes delusional, perhaps. But I wanted to ask you a little bit, to unpack a little bit more. Like you're talking about your ideal scenario in 2098, but in terms of the signals we see right now in the global health landscape, there is a pandemic agreement being negotiated, the IHR amendments happening. And pardon my ignorance, I wasn't here all day today. So for many years, we've been hearing things about a framework convention of global health, which has never fully really been realized. Based on what you're seeing in terms of the social, technological, political scenario today, what are the other plausible scenarios for health and human rights?
I'll begin to answer this, and then I think I'm going to kick it over to the other panelists, and also to those of you in the audience, because I'm very, very interested to hear your responses. I mean, in terms of, do you want me to answer this in terms of the real or the fantastical? Because if we're going to speak about the real, I think I don't foresee that the pandemic treaty, if there is indeed a pandemic treaty, is going to do anything transformational for human rights. Hopefully it'll advance something around health governance. Hopefully at the other side of that process, we'll have something better than we have today. But I think the likelihood is very strong that it's going to be kind of killed in the details. And, we're already seeing this happen with kind of some of the language around human rights, the IP provisions, etc. So in the real, I think there may be, I hope that we'd have something more, but I think maybe even incremental progress might be progress. In the fantastical, we would see something completely different to what we will get. It would be something that took a rhetorical embrace of the right to health and extended it in all the ways that we'd want to see it extended when it comes to IP, access to essential health goods, all the things. I mean, I can turn this over to, my scholars and colleagues here. I think we all have our fantasies about what that might look like. And I think we're kind of stuck between the two, will we get from a negotiating process the transformational? Definitely not. But maybe down the line, the thing that has always produced change, human rights transformation and change has always come from civil society. Always. It is never, ever. That is where we have to look for the revolutionary, for the transformational. And that would be my answer. perhaps.
So I agree, Lisa, that is a very important question. But I'm not, when you press hard that question, I'm not looking optimistic, unfortunately, because non-state actors have been powered so much in this space that even major states are ceding their powers to non-state actors. And like Professor Yasmin was saying, there's a lot of wealth transfer from the global south to the global north, creating more inequalities and inequities. But look at this scenario. I know that technology is a double-edged sword. Look at Uber showed up and taxi business just disappeared. But who gets so much money from Uber? They are in California and nowhere else. So one thing I see is that democratization of technology will radically shift some of this because capital follows the money. And another thing is the issue of population. I do and co-lead a program called Open African Innovation Research. And one thing we are pushing ahead is one of the strongest advantage the continent of Africa has is what we call the youth bulge. And the ability to access technology and invert so many things that were deprived of that continent for so long. So the only glare of hope you get, but then when these youth begin to manifest their talent, somebody from Silicon Valley comes in with a net and gets them out of the space and takes them away. So however you slice and dice it, I think there's a lot of hope in technology, but it depends on how it flips. So much is so unpredictable for the pandemic treaty and all other treaties going on in parallel, and all the geopolitical power dynamics and the influence of private capital. They do not give me significant degree of enthusiasm, other than that something might have to rupture that will really change the whole dynamic. Whatever that is, I don't know.
Thanks, Chidi. Well, thanks, Chidi. Christian?
So Christian's had to leave,
Oh,
unfortunately.
that's right. He did. I'm sorry. He had to leave early. Judith, please. And then I think we'll move towards wrapping up.
Yeah, I completely agree with Chidi's comments, and I was more or less going to say the same thing, but maybe just to elaborate on a couple of things. I mean, you know, I don't mean to end the event on a downer, but I'm also quite deeply skeptical and depressed at the moment about the direction of travel. And actually, you know, the more I think about it and the work that I do on global health, and I work also on climate change and human rights, the more I work on it, the more it seems to me that the obstacle is capitalism, as it is currently constituted. You know, and it's sort of globalized, made more complicated by its increasingly globalized form, and those sort of inequalities in control of production and in power and so on and so forth, you know, and the profit, the sort of drive for profit is deeply undermining human rights, whether it's in global health or whether it's in relation to the climate and ecological crises. So how we change things, I don't know, but you know, they will have to change in some way at some point, with the, particularly in the light of sort of the environmental situation, they will have to change, but when and how, I don't know how that will be. And I also just wanted to respond to Chidi's, I think your presentation was really interesting, and I completely agree that when it comes to Indigenous populations, I think that health and the human rights community has a long way to go in terms of transforming and adapting and learning from Indigenous populations in its approach to health, and I completely endorse your comments in that area as well. And finally, just to John, my decision to show the chalking of the steps was partly influenced by the fact that knew you were speaking at this event. And yes, I know a little bit about its history and your involvement in it. So thank you.
So maybe I'll use the very sage thoughts from all three of you to wrap up and turn it back over to Rujin to provide the closing remarks. Someone said, how will things change? I think that's what you said a minute ago, Judith. I'm not sure how things will change or what needs to change. And I want to come back to what Lisa said a few minutes ago. She said it's always come from civil society. And it's not a pitch. It's not a plant. But it is, I think, a reality and a practicality. And I'll share with you, this past summer, I spent a good chunk of the month of July in Kenya, visiting a number of projects in rural Kenya, which is very, very poor relative to the larger cities that give us maybe a bit of a distorted sense of Kenya as a middle income country. It's not that it isn't, but the disparities are very, very significant. And I spent the better part of a week visiting very, very rural health clinics that primarily work with young girls who are 13, 14, 15 years old, sometimes boys. Virtually all of those girls have several children. Several before their 18th birthday. And we're working week by week, month by month, with a last mile approach to bring a rights-based set of practices to a group of young women who have all of the potential, that youth quake that is ready to burst across much of Africa needs a few extra ingredients. Technology is critical. We're providing sexual health and reproductive rights education through cell phones so that girls can read it privately, so that no one can see it. Those are a few very tangible examples of the things that we're doing. We're providing family planning materials and supplies. In some of those communities, that is groundbreaking work. So my ask of all of you is to keep doing what you do. And when you see the news every night, and when you hear the stories that are so difficult to hear, please don't look away. The worst thing that you can do for the vulnerable people of the world who desperately need what these four wise people have been talking about this afternoon, the worst thing that any of us can do is to take the luxury of looking away. I told you it would be dark when we finished. Thank you for your patience and your thoughtfulness. Thank you. Christian, I know you're not here, but thank you, Judith, Chidi, and Lisa, for your very thought-provoking end for our afternoon. As I said earlier, we are in a turbulent world. We have the comfort of living under extraordinarily blessed lives. And it's important not to look away so that we advance that health justice that all of us seek. Thank you. And back to you, Rujin.
Hey, well, I promise I won't be more than 2 minutes. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to everyone for sticking with us. Really, this is quite an impressive turnout for a late Friday night dark time in Ottawa. So huge thank you for sticking with us till right to the very end. Huge thanks to our last panelists who were amazing and who it's a really hard act to follow, so I'm not going to try. I did want to just close and leave us off with 3 key reflections and action points for taking away with us today. And the first is that today, one of the words that we opened this event with was the term hyperdisciplinarity. And I think today more than ever, and more than perhaps any time in history, we need to internalize hyperdisciplinarity within our own work. This event in particular was conceptualized around commemorating the health, really the 75th year anniversary of the health and human rights, the birth of that movement and everything that ensued after 1948. But the linkages between health and human rights are complex and span such a breadth of fields that alliances between even health workers, lawyers, advocates is just not enough today. What we need is far more engagement, for instance, with fields of economics, with taxation, with global governance, with politics. We need hyperdisciplinarity to increasingly become the status quo for all of us in our own fields of practice, and especially for students. And the work that you do, unfortunately, it will mean that we are all going to be constantly students in any field that we practice in. We didn't touch on the looming age of AI today, but that in and of itself begs a hyperdisciplinarity of its own that we may yet be prepared to embrace. So that's the first thought. The second thought is that global health governance is important, but a much greater recognition is needed, as it has always been needed, about lateral movements of ideas, bottom-up approaches to getting ideas to become practice, as John's really eloquent and beautiful story conveyed for us today. So we absolutely need to. It is important to think about those high-level instruments, but we cannot do that without looking at norm dissemination and discourse in our day-to-day. And the final thing I want to say is that we've had a 75th year anniversary as an excuse, really, to bring everyone together. I think that we don't need to wait another 25 years for a 100th year to bring this community of practice together. So please, let's continue the conversation. We have a critical mass of people in Ottawa, many of whom could not speak today because there was just not enough time in the hours of the day to have more people to speak. But we have such a community here that I think we should continue to build on that and bring people together. And on that note, on the note of the village that it takes to bring people together, please allow me to just say a few words of thanks for everyone who made this event possible. Thank you especially to the speakers who were joining us today. Thank you to the speakers who traveled and braved the Ottawa snow and had to buy boots to come and be with us today. Thank you to those who joined in late hours, who traveled in their own way, joining at late hours of their day to make it for us. It's really just such a huge boon for us to have them here. Of course, huge thanks goes to our dean for encouraging this event and being there to open it. Thank you, Professor Packer, and the Human Rights Research and Education Center. Thank you, Chidi, I almost forgot that you're still on the panel. So thank you, Chidi, for staying up as well to work with us and getting this panel and this event going. And of course, to Errol Mendez, who's no longer here, and to the students. You guys are really such troopers. They're first-year students, many of them. I don't know, some of the others I may not know by face, but I know they're first-year students. I know they're scared about their exams. At least they shouldn't be, but I think they are. And I just really, yeah, you're wonderful. Thank you to Helen and Jacob, Ariel, Rebecca, for being such amazing volunteers throughout the day. And Claudia Baudouin. I don't know if she's still here, but thank you. Yeah, so it takes a village, really, and we have to just build on this village and continue to keep going with these types of events. Thank you so much.